Good evening. My name is Dan Rober. I am Associate Professor of Catholic Studies at Sacred Heart University, and I am the co-editor, along with Callie Tabor, who is on our call, of the Go Rebuild My House blog. For those who are new to our forum, I recommend checking it out. We have a recent column by Miroslav Tatarin and a new one coming up tomorrow from David Gibson. I'm pleased to introduce our panel tonight, Quo Vadis, Where is U.S. Catholicism Going? Our host for this evening will be Dr. Michael Higgins. He is the inaugural Basilian Distinguished Fellow of Contemporary Catholic Thought at the University of St. Michael's College at the University of Toronto. I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Higgins, who will welcome our esteemed panelists. So I now turn the evening over to Dr. Higgins.
Thank you, Dan. It's a pleasure to be back. In fact, I've not entirely left. I'm also a distinguished professor of Catholic Thought Emeritus at Sacred Heart, and it is a pleasure to be back in a community to which I'm considerably attached. Welcome, everyone, and welcome back for some of you, and a welcome for the first time to some others. This is the second in a series of sponsored public discussions and conversations funded by Sacred Heart University under the aegis of the ecclesial reform blog, Go Rebuild. The first of the series was in January of this year, and it was called Francis is a Schism on the Horizon, and consisted of many of our blog members, including Tina Beattie, David Gibson, Christopher Lamb, and Michael Sean Winters, all members of our blog, as indeed it is tonight. All the speakers you will see tonight are bloggers on Go Rebuild. Tonight's focus is Quo Vadis. Where is U.S. Catholicism going? In a time of heightened polarization, both politically and ecclesiastically, the turmoil within U.S. Catholicism can be both a harbinger of dissolution and an occasion for fresh seeing and fresh thinking. Our panel, which I will introduce in a moment, will explore the challenges on the horizon, drawing on their respective wisdom and life experience, looking at the unmaking and hopefully the making anew. I'm going to go alphabetically because that's the easiest way to go and most equitable. We'll start off with Colleen Dooley, who is the associate editor of America Magazine. She's also assistant producer of audio and video at America Media. She has a forthcoming book, actually, on the French author, social worker, and mystic Madeleine Delbrel, which will be published by Liturgical Press. And in 2019, she was the Catholic Press Association Multimedia Journalist of the Year. Welcome, Colleen.
Hello, thanks for having me.
The next one is Robert Ellsberg. Robert Ellsberg is very much a known entity in the Catholic community right across the United States and indeed outside. He is the editor-in-chief and publisher of Orbis Books, and he's the author and editor of many books, including Dictaton, The Essential Writings, All Saints, Daily Reflections on Saints, Prophets, and Witnesses for Our Time, The Saint's Guide to Happiness, Practical Lessons in the Life of the Spirit, Blessed Among All Women, Women Saints. I think you can see the pattern here. Robert has a keen interest in sanctity. And of course, the writings of Dorothy Day. Most importantly, his most recent work, just come out actually, is Dearest Sister Wendy, a surprising story of faith and friendship. Welcome, Robert.
Thank you.
Paul Lakeland is the Aloysius P. Kelly, S.J. Professor of Catholic Studies and Director of the Center for Catholic Studies at Fairfield University's College of Arts and Sciences, and where he is also Professor of Religious Studies. Paul has quite a distinguished career as a theologian and administrator. He's the author of many books, including most recently, The Wounded Angel, Fiction and the Religious Imagination, A Council That Will Never End, Church, Living Communion, Catholicism at the Crossroads, How the Laity Can Save the Church, and countless articles, public addresses, columns, and blog entries. He's also the recipient of the Monica Hellwig Award for contributions to the Catholic intellectual tradition given by the Association of Catholic Colleges and Universities, its highest award. Welcome, Paul. And our newest guest and our newest blogger, right from Mexico City, really underscoring the fact that we are an international panel tonight, is Dr. Ish Lewis, who holds a doctorate in theology and ethics from the Graduate Theological Union and is currently the Provo Postdoctoral Teaching Fellow in Catholic Studies at Candler School of Theology at Emory University. Dr. Ruiz's research interests explore the intersection between queer theology, Latinx theology, ecclesiology, sexual ethics, liberation, human rights, and indeed Catholic education. He has published articles on the inclusion of LGBTQ+ persons in Catholic schools and has actively ministered to queer Catholic school educators and students for almost a decade. And he's becoming a prolific author and contributor to various Catholic magazines and journals in the United States. Welcome, Ish. So here's our panel. And I'm going to ask them to open up the conversation through, by means or through the lens, if you like, of a reflection of their own. And then what will happen is, after we've gone through the panel, I'll ask various questions and the panel will engage among themselves on some of the issues raised or some of the issues they want to raise. And then we will segue to a question and answer with you, our viewers. And they will be channeled through Dan Rover and Kaylee Tibor, who are our co-editors for this evening, and indeed the co-editors and coordinators of the Go With Build blog. So let's start off with you, Colleen.
Yeah, I'm nervous to be going first. As a reporter, I'm not too fond of having to make crystal ball predictions of where we're headed as a Catholic Church, but I'll do my best. So obviously, as a reporter, the first thing that I'm thinking of in terms of where US Catholicism is going is in terms of demographics, right? We know that the US Church is shrinking, is losing members, is particularly losing members to other religions or religious disaffiliation as a whole. We also know that the Latino share of the church is growing, right? But that is sort of stalling. Gen Alpha, this new generation of kids, is less religious than any previous generation. And we see that also slowing the pace of the growth of Latino Catholicism in the US. So I think that's really interesting. I think it's also a call to action for the Catholic Church to start to try to figure this out, figure out how to better, I think, especially integrate Latino and Anglo communities together. I see Ish nodding, so I'm taking that as a good sign that he agrees. But yeah, in many parishes, and this has been my experience growing up in a bicultural, bilingual parish in Missouri, is that they function as separate groups. You kind of have a Latino parish and an Anglo parish in one, but that don't interact all that much, except for maybe we've had fish tacos at the fish fry, right? But mostly separate liturgies, separate communities, separate events. So I think that, you know, there's a call to action there for more integration. And for many legacy Catholic publications, and this is, you know, myself included as an editor at America Magazine, to broaden our focus, because right now it is, you know, the vast majority of our coverage is of this kind of legacy audience, right? White, maybe Northeastern, highly educated Catholics. So that's the demographic overview. Politically, I think US politics is intertwined with Catholicism. It's obvious to say that in just what seems like an irreversible way at this point. And one thing I want to draw attention to is I really think that the partisanship that we're seeing and the polarization that we're seeing is going to continue at least for the next few years. I know that generally there's a tendency in the US for politics to go, you know, a little bit more towards the extremes and then come more moderate and so on. But I think that we're going to see this partisanship continue. And the reason I think that is because and this is going to be controversial to say, but the Eucharistic Congress that the USCCB is planning is falling during an election year. It was, you know, we got the news of it and of their big investment of $28 million in it after the bishops spent about 2 years debating very explicitly excommunicating or denying communion to pro-choice Democratic politicians. And if you look back to the 1976 Eucharistic Congress, Gerald Ford, who was running as a Republican in that election, gave a campaign speech at that Eucharistic Congress. So I'm not saying that that will exactly repeat itself again, but I think that it's significant that we've had this very polarized US politics driven discussion of who can and cannot receive communion, and that is going to be rehashed again, probably during this election year in 2024. And then finally, church politically, I host a Vatican podcast, so I'm always thinking about this, but the resistance to Pope Francis in the US is pretty unique throughout the world. It's extremely well-funded, as our fellow blogger Christopher Lamb outlined and detailed so effectively in his book, The Outsider. And I think that generally it's hard to predict with this one because, we don't know how long the Francis pontificate will last, hopefully very long. We don't know who will be elected after him. But I think that that the resistance to Francis will probably continue for so long as there continues to be a majority of John Paul and Benedict appointees in the US College of Bishops. We know that Pope Francis's new team of Americans in the Congregation for Bishops, now the Dicastery for Bishops, is Cardinals Tobin and Supich. And so they're very much in the Francis mold. They're probably choosing bishops in the Francis mold. We also have women for the first time being able to give their voices as members of that dicastery. So I think that may change, that we may get more Francis mold type of bishops, but that is a very, very slow change. I think that's like a 50-year timeline for that to make any difference. And as I said before, that it all depends on what kind of popes that we continue having. And then I guess the big question here is also synodality going forward. I think that so far it's being largely ignored in the US. The dioceses that have most leaned into this synod on synodality, which has so much potential to transform the church, have been the dioceses that already had an experience of synodality in their diocese, that had already had a diocesan synod or whatever. I've been doing a bunch of reporting on this, and I don't see it catching on in a major way in the US, and I lament that because I think that could be a massive source of kind of reinvigorating the church in the US. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Colleen. Robert.
Hello. I was struck by the proposed title for this evening's discussion, Quo Vadis, where are you going, whither goest thou? And that comes, of course, from a famous legend in which St. Peter, fleeing the certainty of persecution, is heading away from Rome on the Appian Way. When he encounters the risen Christ, Quo Vadis, he asks the Lord, who replies, I'm going to Rome to be crucified again. And this encounter restores Peter's faith and courage, and he turns around and proceeds back to Rome to face his own martyrdom. So the question before us tonight is, where is American Catholicism headed? And of course, one must allow, as Colleen noted, that American Catholicism is a broad tent that incorporates a family marked by very vast differences. And I certainly don't mean to identify Catholicism with the bishops, but as the shepherds of the church, they are the natural analog to the story of St. Peter, entrusted with special responsibility for where the flock is headed. And the association with this legend about St. Peter is telling. Where is American Catholicism heading? Is it pursuing the way of Jesus? Is its course determined by by Jesus's example of self-emptying, poverty, nonviolence, his place among the marginalized, the despised, the suffering? Or is its course determined more by interests of self-preservation, security, what Pope Francis calls spiritual worldliness? 10 years ago, in one of his last acts before becoming Pope Francis, Cardinal Bergoglio gave a speech at the conclave in Rome that so moved the cardinal electors that they chose him to be Pope. His short remarks were a kind of quo vadis challenge for the church. He said, first of all, that evangelization presupposes a desire in the church to come out of herself, to go to the peripheries, not just geographical, but existential, where people are in pain, suffering injustice, where they're ignorant or indifferent to religion. Secondly, he said that a church that does not do this becomes self-referential and sick. He refers to a kind of theological narcissism. He spoke of the text in scripture about Christ knocking on the door, which we usually think about as Christ trying to come in, but he thinks that often Jesus is knocking from within because we do not want to let him out. The self-referential church keeps Jesus Christ within herself and does not let him out. In this self-referentiality, the church believes she has her own light. She ceases to be the mystery of the moon, he says, that reflects the light of the sun, or in this case, Christ, and so succumbs to spiritual worldliness, which he says is the worst evil that can befall the church. Put simply, he says there are two images of the church: a church which evangelizes and comes out of herself, and the worldly church that lives within herself, of herself, for herself. To translate this question into the terms of the question before us, where is American Catholicism going? The question is whether this is a church that follows Jesus out to the margins and peripheries, even at the risk of being disdained by rich and powerful forces. A church, as Pope Francis says, which is bruised, hurting, and dirty because it has been out on the streets, or a church which is unhealthy from being confined and from clinging to its own security. Pope Francis's words at the conclave provided a succinct summary of the pastoral and evangelical mission he has pursued over the past 10 years. And I remember how many American prelates in the first years repeatedly expressed their confusion about what he was trying to do. But there was absolutely nothing confusing about it. He was calling for the church to move out of its self-referentiality, its spiritual worldliness, its theological narcissism, to reflect more the spirit of Jesus. And his actions elicited from many sources in the church, especially from American bishops, certain bishops, and powerful media, reactions very similar to the charges that were laid against Jesus, as Chris Lamb pointed out in his book, The Outsider, which I was happy to publish at Orbis. The charge that he was disregarding the law, that he was overturning precedents and customs, that he was showing too much mercy towards sinners and outsiders, that he seemed to prefer the poor and rabble to the self-proclaimed good religious people and those who were the chief benefactors of religion. By and large, I believe the American bishops have done their best to keep their flock unaware of the message and agenda of Pope Francis. A certain number have insinuated that he's actually a false pope and have pointed toward actual schism. But for the most part, they have acted as if his priorities and his agenda are discretionary and not to be taken seriously. For as long as most of us can remember, the clear, unequivocal priority of the American bishops has been the overturning of Roe v. Wade. That was the alpha and omega of Catholic social concern in this country. The effect of this was to establish an effective alliance with the religious right and the Republican Party, which cynically used the pro-life banner and other culture war wedge issues to promote an agenda largely inimical to the principles of Catholic social teaching. For me, this culminated in a conference call before the 2020 election between Donald Trump and a group of 600 Catholic bishops and other leaders, in which the bishops warmly welcomed his support for religious freedom, Catholic schools, and his pro-life cause. Trump, in turn, pronounced himself the best president in the history of American Catholicism. And none of the bishops on that call uttered a mumbling word of protest. I know that some defended the bishops for making this transactional compact with an evident psychopath in order to achieve particular goals of importance to the Catholic community. But the problem with such a strategy is that you can't really carve out the policies you support and disregard the rest. You're buying the whole package: the racism, the theater of cruelty, the plundering of the planet, the death penalty, the corruption and orgy of greed. The election might have offered an off-ramp from this strategy, but on Inauguration Day itself, when blood had only recently been washed from the Capitol steps, the president of the Bishops' Conference issued a statement noting that the new president, who famously embraces his Catholic faith, quote, has pledged to pursue certain policies that would advance moral evils and threaten human life and dignity, most seriously in the areas of abortion, contraception, marriage, and gender. For months afterward, the bishops debated the implications of, quote, Eucharistic coherence, warning of the confusion of the faithful, should President Biden and other Catholic politicians like Nancy Pelosi be allowed to receive communion. And yet one could legitimately ask whether the bishops themselves had created confusion among the faithful about what the Catholic Church actually teaches. Pope Francis has made it clear that concerns for refugees, opposition to the death penalty, and care for the earth are inseparable from the Church's commitment to life. And yet, if that teaching was lost on many American Catholics, who bore the blame for that confusion? And so, quo vadis, where are we headed? Who will lead us? The stakes in this moment are incredibly dire as we face an election that could be a crossroads for this country. And I don't want to characterize that as a choice between Republicans and Democrats, but it's hard not to see a vivid contrast between the America First agenda that appeals to power and xenophobic tribalism, and a vision that emphasizes the common good, concern for those at the margins, and care for creation. Those who may determine the direction of American Catholicism include advocates of both tendencies, and each one of us will contribute to the answer. I would conclude with the hopeful message shared by Amanda Gorman, the young Catholic and African American woman who shared her poem at the inauguration that ended with these words: "When day comes, we step out of the shade, aflame and unafraid. The new dawn blooms as we free it, for there is always light, if only we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it." Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Paul.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Colleen. What I have to say is in some respects in the same ballpark, but I'm going to express it slightly differently. I want to take a little historical tour to get to where we are today. But I want to start with two firm statements that cover the ground that I want to talk about. The first is this: the future of the church depends on what Catholics think and do, not what the hierarchy wants. One could easily imagine a church that was full of bishops and the pews were empty. I mean, certainly in my own home country, the Anglican Church often looks that way, and that could easily happen here. So it's what the Catholics think and do, not what the hierarchy wants. And the other, the pervasive question for American Catholics now and for the past 150 years is the following: how can a good Catholic be a good American? That's the question that began with the great immigration of the mid-19th century, and I'm going to suggest it's still with us today. So it came to a head, this is the little history lesson, but you mostly probably know it anyway. It came to a head in 1899 when Pope Leo XIII wrote a letter to Cardinal Gibbons, the Cardinal Archbishop of Baltimore at the time, criticizing what he called the heresy of Americanism. That is, the heresy that sort of came from people like Isaac Hecker and Bishop John Ireland, which was, from their perspective, an effort to show how valuable the Catholic intellectual and religious traditions were to the American Republic, trying to overcome so much of the anti-Catholicism that had bedeviled America for decades before that. When the Pope's letter was promulgated, nothing much happened. The bishops didn't really respond to it much, and American Catholics probably didn't even know about it, never really heard about it much, never thought about it, and continued for the next 50, 60 years to try to find a way to be Catholic in America. And the first thing they did, or the big thing that happened in the first half of the 20th century, was the development of this enormous Catholic subculture that kind of paralleled so much of American life, so that as as people have said about that period of time, the only time Catholics ever met or talked to non-Catholics was in the workplace. Other than that, it was the Catholic, I don't want to say it, but let's say ghetto. 1960 comes along and John F. Kennedy is elected president. And Catholics at that point abandon the subculture. That's really the moment at which the subculture begins to dissipate and slowly disappear. And it does so because I think Catholics are probably thinking, well, there's no problem now being Catholic in America, and look at JFK. As that subculture declined and disappeared to the present day, it seems to me that what we can say about the present day is there is no difference between American Catholics and the rest of America. Red and blue, you find Catholics on both sides. Pro-life, pro-choice, you find Catholics going in both directions. Democrat, Republican, you name the issue. Catholics, broadly speaking, break down on issues more or less the same as the rest of the American population. Which leaves me sort of asking the question, so what purpose is the church serving as a public institution? What's so special about being Catholic if it does not indicate any sort of place where we stand as a community? You know, I've always thought that all Catholics should be registered independent, not Democrat or Republican. And I do like the words of Bishop John Stowe. I forget where he said this, but it was public somewhere. He said, you know, the church should be political, but not partisan, but it should be engaged in political issues. So as we think about this sort of the future, I think we have to say that only if we stand for something do we have a healthy future. And I don't think that something is going to be that issue or that issue or that issue, because we're going to have differences of opinion on issues. I think that what we have to stand for is the cure for polarization, picking up on something Robert said there, the cure for polarization, which Francis thinks lies in dialogue within the church and between the church and the world, which of course comes back to Colleen's point about synodality. A synodal church, or a church in which we find the way to dialogue with one another, which will not remove difference, but will remove polarization, is the best challenge to American individualism, which in my opinion is our, as Americans, our besetting sin. So conversion to dialogue, or we fade away into factionalism. And factionalism is not Catholic. Seems to me, then I'll just finish with this thought, that the future of the church in America is uncertain, but it will depend directly on the energy which the Catholic laity devote to the project of becoming one loving community, modeling for and challenging our America. Those are my words.
Thank you, Paul. Ish.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much. Ish Ruiz here. I am currently in Mexico City, but I do come to this conversation as a gay Puerto Rican theologian who is a Catholic as well. And also I should mention that before my current appointment, I was a high school teacher for 11 years. So the perspective of our youth also plays a very big role in my theological opinion on where is our U.S. Catholicism going. I'll draw from all of these as I continue. I had some prepared remarks. A lot of my fellow colleagues here on the panel hinted on or already touched upon most of these. So I'm just going to simply grab some of the stuff that they talked about and expound a little bit. Robert, you spoke a lot about the polarization of the church, and I thought, something interesting that I came across when I was doing research on the polarization of the church is the concept of scandal and opposite scandal. When bishops, for example, put these morality clauses into teachers' contracts, saying they can't perform certain acts of sexual morality, otherwise they will confuse the students, they will scandalize the faithful. They unfortunately they sometimes run a risk of the question of opposite scandal. So what happens when your attempt to protect students from or the faithful from a particular scandal then creates another scandal, such as, for example, that LGBTQ plus people are not necessarily welcome as full members of this church. And so this idea of trying to prevent confusion often leads to different kinds of confusion. Lisa Fulham wrote an article in America Magazine about opposite scandal, which I found really insightful. Paul, you spoke about the smaller, purer church full of bishops, and I honestly don't think that's ever even existed. Not only do I think it's possible, but I don't think that church has ever existed, nor will ever exist. Right? We have all these accounts of matters of integrity and lack of integrity within our church, even those who purport to follow church teaching to the letter, right? And of course, Colleen spoke a lot about synodality and the Latinx population of the church. And I do use the term Latinx as a means to be inclusive to members of the LGBTQ plus community. So who also identify as Latinx. And the difference that Pope Francis has made. And so I'll kind of center a lot of my comments on that. A lot of synodality, as many of you pointed out, the big challenge with synodality, as many of you pointed out, is this polarization that takes place in our church. And so if I were to put on a practical theologian's hat on, how do we move forward? How do we actually make synodality take hold in the church? I came across this teaching, this moral doctrine called probabilism. Probabilism is a moral doctrine that I believe might give us a little bit of a solution, might push us forward as to how can we engage in synodal dialogue in a polarized church. Here's how I would define probabilism. It would be a tool that would help a human conscience freely navigate questions of moral doubt. And here's how it works. If a particular doctrine or principle is rendered doubtful due to a number of factors, I'll give you an example. Teachings on homosexuality in the church, which have not been received by the lay faithful, do not necessarily reflect the reality of many LGBTQ plus Catholics. Have many members in the hierarchy have called for reform of the church, especially after the synodal process, such as the one in Germany. And there's a robust body of revisionist theology in the matter. I would say the combination of those factors renders this teaching, quote unquote, doubtful. Then probabilism would kick in. What probabilism would do would be to say, hey, there is some reasonable difference of opinion in this matter. Can we all coexist and respect each other's freedom to form our conscience on these matters? And I think that that tool might be a way, a compromise, but a way to move forward through this polarization in a synodal way. And it's a compromise. No one likes compromise. As a gay man, I would rather see the church's teaching change now. But I know that from where the church is right now to where I would like it to be, it needs to go through the middle, through that compromise. And what I would predict the U.S. Where I would predict the U.S. church is going is toward a necessary tolerance of difference. Can we all disagree on certain matters of church life that I would argue are not creedal or core to the main tenets of our faith, and still remain as a community together? I draw back to my experience as a high school teacher where I had to do this, where I had to bring up matters of death penalty, immigration, and had teenagers who disagreed with each other still have to respect each other, be a part of a classroom community for a whole year. And if teenagers can do it, I think we can all agree that we can find a way forward to do that. The last part that I want to talk about was something that Colleen brought up about Latinx church. I'll also include the LGBTQ plus community, which was acknowledged in the latest synodal report as being a pressing concern. Yes, I agree. We need to make room for Latinx people. We need to make room for LGBTQ plus people, not just as not just to accommodate them and give them a Spanish mass at a different time, but to integrate them into the life in structures of the church. I can think of my own community at Emory University, which there's a lot of artwork around the Candler School of Theology from John August Swanson, Mexican American artist, Catholic artist, and he, but if I were to walk into Candler School of Theology, I'd say, wow, there's a lot of Latinx visuals, but is that all we are? Are Latinx people just showcased, just framed, or do we form a part of the structure? And actually, Candler School of Theology recently made a cluster hire of Latinx faculty, myself being one of them, another full-time teacher, and an associate dean who has been an amazing promoter of Latinx community. And that's a way in which Latinx people become not just pictures or frames around the campus, but an integral part of the campus life that can affect the structure and life of the church. Same thing with LGBTQ plus people, although I admit that there's a challenge of magisterial doctrine, right? Each issue of diversity is going to be different. But more than just doing so because Latinx people are a growing population, or just simply for pragmatic reasons of retention, Latinx perspective and queer perspective offer unique contributions to Catholic theology that we need to understand. And I go back to that probabilism question. Queer Catholics have to reconcile a queer identity and a Catholic identity that are hostile to each other. And I here not only draw from my own experience, but the experience of my young adult Catholic community in San Francisco, where I spent 8 years in a queer Catholic community with people who were able to embrace that tension, people who disagreed, yet we were walking forward as a community together. So folding in Latinx perspectives, which also have to do the same thing: theology of the border, theology of mestizaje, theology of lo cotidiano, finding God in everyday things, are incredibly invaluable and needed in our church today as a whole, were it to move forward. So the folding in of Latinx and queer people into the Catholic Church through synodal dialogue, more than just as a matter of retention and keeping butts in the pews, if you will, is rather a harvesting of an invaluable perspective that can help the church move forward, embrace the tension of difference, and walk together as a community guided by the Holy Spirit, as synodality is meant to do. I'll conclude my remarks with that.
Thank you, Ish, and thank all of you. You executed my request to give succinct and focused reflections drawn from your own experience wonderfully well. And so now we have a lot of material out there. It's not inchoate, but we have to bring it into some kind of focus. So the first question I'm going to ask on the basis of what has been said strikes this person who straddled the border between the United States and Canada for over a decade, is the question of excluding or using the sacraments, particularly the Eucharist, as a means of penalty for recalcitrant and unfaithful Catholics in political life. That's rather unique to the U.S., to the global Catholic experience. I think in Italy, Pius XII concluded pretty quickly after the threat of the communist takeover after the Second World War that if he was to follow through on excommunicating all Italian citizens that voted for the Communist Party, he would have the church in Italy. So clearly, it's not a good move. In Canada, for instance, it was Prime Minister Trudeau, not Justin, but his father, Pierre, who introduced legislation that resulted in the kind of changes to abortion legislation in Canada, similar to what happened in the United Kingdom in the late 1960s. Similarly, it was a Catholic Prime Minister again, Paul Martin, who introduced same-sex legislation. And although there was some resistance from the hierarchy, only one bishop of the 100 Canadian bishops who threatened not to distribute communion to this Catholic prime minister, his own parish priest in Montreal made a very public statement in the Canadian equivalent of Times Magazine, which is Maclean's magazine, that the prime minister would be welcome to receive communion from him at any time. In short, my point is, why is this an issue in the US when in a good part of the world, it's not? Okay, anyone want to throw their hand in at this point? Paul, you provided some of the historical perspective here. What do you think? Why is it unique to the US?
Because I think the U.S. hierarchy includes people who are very authoritarian by temperament, who want to throw their weight around. I think that, the one book I want to write that I will never write, and I've always known I will never write this, is a book on Catholicism and fascism. And one of the subsections of that would be looking at the way in which some members of the hierarchy imagine the relationship between them and the people. I think it's a very sad situation, but I think the answer is not that it's not American culture. It's the personality of certain bishops that, because most of the bishops, even the ones with whom I'd have very little to agree, don't take that step. It's a few who want to flex their authoritarian muscles. So sort of the super clericalists, I guess. I don't think it's an American thing. I think the better question to ask, Michael, is why are there this kind of bishop appointed in the American church, somewhere else?
Well, Robert, you've got your next book for Orbis here, Catholicism and Fascism by Paul Lakeland. I'd like to take an agent's commission fee for this, by the way. It does raise a strong point about the ultra clerical mentality of some of the bishops in the United States. We argue regularly that they don't constitute the majority, perhaps not, but there's certainly a formidable presence. And they are a problem to the realization of the dream for synodality. I was struck by this in reference to Colleen and both Robert, and I just want to raise this question and throw it out to the panel. And that is, it does seem to me that Francis's great project, or the great project of this pontificate, is synodality. It is true that the US Church seems to be, on the whole, relatively tepid in its response to this process. And if we look at the Australian experience and the Irish experience, as chronicled by our friend and fellow blogger, Christopher Lamb, again, the US and the Canadian Church, I'm afraid, in this particular instance, are very much on the side of tepidity, very much on the side of timidity. Is it because they don't take Francis seriously, or is it because they take him too seriously, or seriously enough that they want to put hurdles in the way of the synodality issue? Colleen, Ish, you both raised synodality in your comments. What do you think?
I mean, again, I'm hesitant to read into someone's motives here when I don't know them, but I just want to raise that there is one practical concern that played into this, which was the timing of the announcement of the synodal process. So it was announced in March 2021 by the Vatican that this would be happening, really scant on details. And then it was supposed to start in mid-October. It was late September before the Vatican sent out any instructions on how to do this. So unless you were a diocese that already had an experience of maybe a recent diocesan synod that you could go off of and just assume you would be able to morph into a contribution to this process, most dioceses were not ready at all and didn't actually know what was being asked of them. And furthermore, a lot of them did their budgets in the spring. It was decided over the summer. And so the Vatican's Synod Office actually got a lot of complaints, and so did the USCCB Synod Office, that they just hadn't set aside any money or resources or like human hours to do this process. So, just trying to add a charitable read here that they may have also been caught off guard. But I do have an interesting anecdote from my reporting, which is that my colleague Doug and I called every diocese in America until we got an answer. And only 50% had even taken, less than 50% had even taken the first step of just appointing someone to locally run the synod by the time the synod started in mid-October. So there's a late start.
Quite a beginning. Ish.
Yeah, I was struck by your question about the relation, the bishops relating synodality to a Pope Francis thing, which is true. It is certainly the landmark effort of his pontificate. And yes, I've seen. I'll combine in my response. I guess I'll combine this American polarization, right, which is a cultural phenomenon that has certainly seeped into our church, with the fact that the opposition to Pope Francis has really begun since the beginning of his pontificate. It wasn't the synodal process that brought about this defense, and so this defensive attitude. And so when I think of the cloth that the previous two popes were cut from, and when I see I think Pope Francis made a joke at the beginning of his pontificate saying, they went to the farthest corner of the earth to find the new pope. I thought, as soon as he got elected, I was already kind of thinking from a Latinx theological perspective, this man is going to come into this position with a completely different theological worldview. And lo and behold, what you have is what I would characterize in many ways as a liberation theology perspective of siding with the poor, of going to the margins, of building a kingdom of justice on earth and not waiting for the kingdom of heaven, which is not necessarily the theological backdrop that the previous popes had. And that showed from the beginning of his pontificate. And so I can see how an American culture of bishops that already is partisan, might have been immediately threatened by a pontificate like this. I'm actually struck by the attempt to exclude or ban politicians from receiving Eucharist, specifically and only focused on a matter of abortion, not necessarily in other matters of pro-life, or indicating pro-life. So, or an attempt to a pro-life stance, such as the death penalty, or even you can broadly talk about immigration issues, gun reform, etc. So it's kind of interesting. I'm not actually quite sure. I'm not quite sure what the motive behind banning these politicians is, but I am sure that congruence with Catholic doctrine is not necessarily it. Not necessarily it.
Good point, Ish. Just before we go on, Dan Wilbur has reminded me to remind our listeners or viewers that they can enter the questions in the YouTube chat and can begin to do so now for Dan and for Callie. Okay, Robert, I want to ask you, and you commented, and I think quite rightly, about Bergoglio's very moving General Congregation talk that contributed in no small part to his election. Do you think the cardinal electors misjudged who they were going to get? Do you think they were as surprised with Bergoglio as they were with Roncalli so many years earlier? Or do you think the cardinals are leap year ahead of the rest of the episcopate?
It's a very interesting question. We published a book you may know by Jerry O'Connell called The Election of Pope Francis. He had been a friend of Bergoglio, he and his wife in Argentina before his election. And he, among all the Vatican journalists, called it and said that it's going to be Bergoglio. But I don't know how much that was wishful thinking. But so he presents a fascinating picture of exactly how the votes came together and coalesced around Bergoglio in the conclave. But even he didn't really answer my question. Well, did they actually know what they were getting themselves into? I think that what Ish says about Bergoglio's Latin American background is interesting in this respect, because the Latin American bishops, they've had their ups and downs and forward and backward and sort of chutes and ladders. But basically, since Vatican II, since 1968, the Medellin Conference, among all the regions of global Catholicism, the Latin American Church has been on a collective journey to try to interpret how the teachings of Vatican II relate to their social, cultural reality. And that took them in a very progressive position, at Medellin. Then there was a little bit of a kickback during when John Paul II came in at Puebla, Santo Domingo. It's always been a fiercely contested struggle between more conservative and more progressive factors. But by the time you get to now I'm help me here, I'm forgetting what was the one where Bergoglio was the coordinated the sorry.
Aparecida? Was it
Aparecida, yes, yeah.
Aparecida.
You see a kind of a consensus has begun to emerge, in which there's this kind of, you could almost call it a synodal sort of collective mentality of the Latin American church, which for which there's nothing like that in the United States. You had this moment in the early 1980s when the bishops were taking on big political or social issues like the economy or nuclear weapons, the challenge of peace, and there, John Paul II and Ratzinger, the head of the CDF, came down very hard on that. They did not want the United States to have its own sort of, social teaching, and they really they reined in the authority and the kind of independence of the American bishops, appointed a bishops at that point who were strictly committed to being agents of the teaching authority of Rome, whose remit was basically to enforce certain kinds of disciplines. And anybody who did not go along with that was squeezed out or certainly not appointed. So there's been this culture here of the bishops as being monitors of orthodoxy and of a certain kind of narrow, I think, conception of what Catholic teaching is. Now, Pope Francis comes along and says, and kind of replaces the priority of doctrine as the important instrument or modality of the church with a pastoral approach, or a more spiritual approach, which the Eucharist is the medicine of mercy. It's not a weapon that you withhold, to enforce policy. But I wanted to pick up also an interesting thing, that Paul, in your historical review, when you think of that so-called Americanist crisis, as you say, I don't think it was really directed to the American church. It was really directed more to France and to forces who were promoting social democracy and social Catholicism in Europe. But the big fear then was a kind of democratizing of Catholicism, somehow diluting or undermining the hierarchical structure, monarchical kind of structure of the church. And the irony here is that here in America, a lot of the Catholic bishops, I think, more identify with that monarchical kind of conception, and are also very threatened by this idea of something that would somehow sort of democratize the church. And we've had little experiments with that, even in this country in the 1970s, with the early call to action conventions that were convened by bishops in Detroit and elsewhere, and listening sessions where people were brought in. And what they didn't like about that is if you actually ask people what their opinions are about things, they're going to call for changes or call for things that the bishops don't want to allow. And so they always squashed that down. So there's, deep in our recent history, I think in our culture in the church in America, a kind of antipathy to anything that dilutes the sole, teaching authority of the bishops. Another little interesting, aspect of that was Cardinal Bernardine's effort to overcome polarization in the church by introducing what he called, the Common Ground Initiative. And the way he was just stomped on by his fellow cardinals, who said there's no common ground if that means we all just agree to disagree. There's, only common ground is around truth. And so they absolutely, from the beginning were opposed to that kind of idea that there can be legitimate diversity of opinions and we're all sort of part of the same family.
One of the rare occasions where there was public disagreement,
Yes.
where the people who disagreed with him wrote letters to the Times or whatever it was. They were out in the open, which bishops never do.
Mhm.
They were really upset by that.
They were. I remember that high drama. We're about that point where we're going to now transition to questions from our listeners. But I just want for a moment to focus on the LGBTQ plus and the youth. So I'm going to go to Ish and Colleen. The future of the church depends on its lifeblood, and its lifeblood is its membership, and its membership is nurtured by and with the young. Is there a future here? I mean, the parishes are hemorrhaging. There's an argument, quite not unreasonable, that the parish structure that we've inherited is in fact no longer functional. Large numbers of young Catholics are disengaged. The percentage that identify as nones now is skyrocketing. What is the future from your perspective, Ish and Colleen?
Yeah, I'll go first. I'll go back to something that Paul was talking about how it is really, closer to the grassroots. That's for the lived experience of churches. And I think bird's eye, it is easy to look at these numbers, these statistics, and despair. The question is, what effect will this, again, not to bring back a conversation of synodality, but these efforts that Pope Francis has been promoting in our church, I wonder what long-term effects they will have precisely on our youth. My experience teaching young people is that all young people, regardless of their sexual orientation or identity or gender identity, well, I wouldn't say all young people, but I would say the majority of young people have this question of non-discrimination as a central principle in their day-to-day life. To put it more directly, my straight students don't want to be a part of a church. They didn't want to be a part of a church that excluded their fellow queer peers or their queer uncles and aunties and parents. So this question of LGBTQ plus inclusion is not self-contained to that small percentage of the world's population that identifies as LGBTQ plus, because everybody has those relationships. And I think there's this growing perception that if I'm a part of a church that is exclusive, that's not a church that I want to be a part of. This pure church, that again, I go to the small pure church, this Orthodox church that is obsessed with rigidity on sexual morality, is really intimidating for young people who are trying to get to know themselves and who are now understanding or now have new language to describe their sexual experiences and their sexual identity. This new language, right, generated largely by the social sciences, has largely been disregarded by the self-referential magisterial church that Robert was talking about. So, yeah, where is the future here? Well, I think you'll find my perspective is that there is some cause for hope closer to the ground. I can think of Michael O'Loughlin published this book, Just Mercy, about the church's response to the HIV/AIDS crises. And when the closer you got to the ground, the more you saw this experience of an inclusive church, or hidden mercy, not Church of Mercy. That's Pope Francis. Hidden mercy, and it is precisely hidden, right? The closer you get to the grassroots, the more you will find that vision of an inclusive church made manifest. And so I wonder to what degree is Pope Francis's call for a synodal church, but also you were just talking about open disagreements, allowing people to openly and publicly disagree. I wonder if that is going to inadvertently bring about some breathing room in the church that young people might actually thrive in. This is why I bring about this idea of probabilism, of really resisting and holding tension and being able to talk about and air out disagreements and still stay committed to the church. I find reason to hope, but people call me a foolish optimist all the time. So I'll wear that. I will wear that title proudly. If I look at the past 20 years, I think there's a reason for hope with regard to inclusion for LGBTQ plus people and listening to the voices of the young. Time will tell.
Okay, Colleen.
I was really nervous before this because I was very aware that my presentation at the beginning leaned very pessimistic. So I appreciate hearing your hopeful perspective. And I guess for me, looking for a sign of hope in the future, you see it at the grassroots more. I certainly see that as well. But I think the thing that gives me so much hope versus the last, 40 years of church history, Vatican history, is that we see that attention to the margins, to the grassroots being embraced at the highest level of the church, right? This is Pope Francis's whole deal. And it is him and Catholics like him that keep me here, for one. I don't know if you would say the same, but I think that when I look at, especially like Gen Z, like my little sister, right? Our generation, we don't remember, and I'm a millennial, but we don't have any memory of the abuse crisis, right? It was just a reality as we were growing up, and maybe our parents tried to shield us from it. Maybe they didn't, but by the time we really were at like a thinking age, this was the starting point for engagement with this church. This was already a church that lacked credibility. And the efforts to increase credibility become ever more important because of that. So I look at, synodality as an effort to rebuild the credibility that was lost during the abuse crisis. And I look at the partisanship, especially in the US hierarchy, but also in the US church, as chipping away at that credibility continually. Like you said, Ish, young people don't want to be part of a church that is discriminating against their favorite teachers or their friends or themselves. So I think in terms of LGBT people, there could be such a huge shift if people would just listen to my coworker, Father Martin, and, start to realize that like LGBT people are as Catholic as you or me or the Pope or any baptized person, because they are baptized too. And LGBT people commit so much and give so much, contribute so much to the church in terms of like talent, beautiful liturgies, right? I was part of a majority queer Zoom church during the pandemic, and it was fantastic because there was just such an eye for beauty there. I think in terms of how we can like move forward on this, I've been surprised that all night evangelization has not come up, even though it is the priority of Pope Francis. It is what he reshaped the whole Roman Curia to be about. And obviously, all of these other efforts that we've been talking about, synodality, that kind of thing, are aimed at evangelization ultimately. I think, the synodal process has been criticized for being too introspective on the church, but I think whenever you open up a discussion like this for the first time, people are going to be looking inward, and that's just to be expected. But looking outward to evangelization, and how do we evangelize young people? One, like I said, we can't do it without being credible. So I think that means a real reckoning with our problems, with our divisions, with the legacy of the abuse crisis. It also means being credible in the way we live. I think about when I had this big like crisis of faith in college or whatever. One of my close friends died by suicide, and I knew the Catholic teaching on that, and I was like, wow, I really can't get behind this. And the thing that brought me back was when I started hanging out with the Catholic workers. And when I went to New York and I learned about people like Dan Berrigan, or I learned about, I got to know these people who were putting their lives or significant parts of their lives on the line to do these, social justice actions, civil disobedience actions because of their faith that then might land them in jail for a few years. And that was credibility to me, that witness that they gave in their lives. And I think that this aligns a lot with what Pope Francis said in his programmatic document, Evangelii Gaudium, right? The joy of the gospel, the joy of evangelizing, is that people are so much more drawn to things like a beautiful life witness, someone who is filled with joy, and you look at them and you're like, I want what they have. That's what evangelization is all about. So I think like the US church has been really, really focused on apologetics. There's a lot of money in it. It goes at evangelization from this defensive posture. And I think that what really needs to be beefed up is the less defensive, more outgoing, witness that looks a lot more like what the Pope outlined in Evangelii Gaudium. And I have hope that Francis is imbuing some of that in the US Church, but I think that that's really the only way to go forward.
I think you're probably quite right on that too, for a number of reasons, and not the least of which, Colleen, is the credibility issue of the leadership, or the particular uniquely uber clerical reality that we sometimes encounter in the authorities, has been greatly devastated, of course, by the sex abuse crisis. And I was thinking, the controversies currently over the German synodal path, which is in a way presages what's going to happen in Rome, or may in the fall of this year, actually originated over the German bishops responding to the sex abuse crisis, the very deep demoralization of the German church. I think you're going to find the same with the French church following the Sauvé report, which is really quite devastating. So I think making an argument, shifting witness and joy in the evangelizing process away from apologetics and episcopal leadership is undoubtedly the right way to go. We're now getting questions that are coming up here, and I would like to start off with the first question. It is this, and it's addressed to all of you. So whoever wants to respond to it is invited to do so. You don't all have to, but if it appeals to you, go for it. Do you think the experience of Catholicism in the United States is dividing along the same regional partisan lines as other parts of the country? Or is indeed the divide to be found elsewhere?
I think that what the data shows us, and I just heard a really interesting presentation on this by someone from the PRRI, the Public Religion, I'm not going to remember it, what it all stands for, but a reputable sociological research place, is that it's not just geography. It's Catholics are more likely to follow the voting habits of all of their cohorts that they're part of. So age, race, education level are ones that come up very often, in addition to geography.
Yeah, Catholics vote like other Americans.
I think you made that point before too.
Yeah, there's no distinction.
Yes.
The Catholic vote is a myth.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I have another question.
The case
go ahead, Robert. Go ahead.
That white Catholics leaned very strongly toward Trump in the 2020 elections, and that's the case, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Here's a question directly coming out of your comment, Paul. Paul Lakeland discussed a book he won't write on fascism and Catholicism, and in particular, U.S. bishops with an authoritarian style. Is an attraction to the alt-right and some fascism on the part of some lay Catholics an example of Americans who have particular Catholic concerns to be addressed for the future of the church and society, finding themselves so aligned? So what do you think?
Well, the short answer is you can't be a Führer unless you have party members, right? So, authoritarian bishops, or, this again breaks down like other Americans. There is a small percentage of the Catholic population who are indistinguishable from, white nationalists of some kind or other. And they are the kind of people who would walk in lockstep, if not jackboots, wherever they felt their anger could be assuaged. I think, when I made that rather facetious remark, which I immediately regretted.
We don't.
I do think that there's something in some Catholics. It was there in Ultramontanism in the middle of the 19th century. There's something in some Catholics that is just viscerally authoritarian or wanting to be subsumed into some authoritarian order. But that doesn't correlate with with Robert's remark that, you know, white Catholics, probably white male Catholics, were particularly pro-Trump in the last election. I'm not saying they're all in that category. I just think that Catholics are like Americans. If there's 5% of Americans who would never abandon their MAGA hat, there's 5% of Catholics who would never abandon their MAGA hat. And this is, you know, I'm just repeating myself, but this is the problem that I see, that we don't have a sense of how, as a community, we can distinguish ourselves in such a way that we challenge the besetting sin of American individualism, which lies behind, neo-economic theories of global market and the way in which we buy into that. All of that is just, there doesn't seem to be any purchase in the Catholic community as community where sufficient numbers of us are standing on very firm ground that says all this is wrong.
Yeah.
Can I add something there?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Go ahead.
I just, here is where I think it's really helpful for us to think of synodality as, I think Austin Ivory was the one who wrote this, as a process of learning to discern communally, right?
Mhm.
Discernment, I think, is what scares people so much about Pope Francis, who want to retreat into this more authoritarian structure, is that his room for discernment, for example, in the case of divorced and remarried people receiving communion, that is where the declarations of confusion come from. And yeah, learning to discern, one, individually, but two, as a community, I think is vital and is what our ultimate goal for dialogue is.
And this circles back to Ish's remark about probabilism. It's the same issue. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Ish, you better respond to that.
Yeah, that I was going to bring up that question of that need for certainty. You know, I think is really striking. I was having an article of mine was published at an outreach, the James Martin LGBTQ plus platform, about ministry to Latinx LGBTQ plus people, and I used the word Latinx, and people on Twitter were having Twitter wars with me. And I was like, hey, listen, these are things you might want to consider, you know, and automatically people were like, but the church teaches this, but the church teaches this. And I was like, people are taking refuge in this idea of like certainty because the church already teaches this. I have the answer. And I think that's kind of interesting. We have to like really learn how to honestly live with the uncertainty. You talk about I lost the word. Colleen, you were just talking about something.
Discernment about community.
Discernment.
Yeah.
You were talking about that idea of discernment, and when we talk about discernment, we are really moving together without really knowing where the answer is, where it's going to take us, and that is very darn scary. And a part of that also includes the question of encounter, which is, you know, encountering the other. And when you're talking about white Catholics, I am wondering where they live and what their interactions are with other people. And then finally, you know, I'm reminded of this Catholic saying, it's in Latin, I'm not going to say in Latin, but, you know, in the essentials unity, in non-essentials liberty, in all things charity.
Yeah,
and really captures that probabilistic understanding. If we can really embrace that idea somehow, you know, encounter the other, learn to live with the uncomfortableness of otherness, and see where God is taking us. That is ultimately the journey of faith. If you're trying to be a person of faith and you want certainty, I don't think you're trying to be a person of faith. You know? Yeah,
Robert.
Yeah, I really resonate with that point, and I think it's so central to Pope Francis's vision, and it came out very clearly in that wonderful interview that he gave in America Magazine very early on, that, you know, delighted a lot of people and freaked a lot of people out. Where he talked about, he says there's, you know, this difference between a laboratory faith or a lab faith, where everything is clear, well defined. You can figure out almost by syllogism, you know, what the answer is going to be. In that kind of a program, uncertainty or doubt are horrible words. In his view, certainty is a negative word. When you're too certain, you're not open to conversion. You're not open to revelation. You're not open to being changed or having your heart, opened up. So he contrasts that with what he calls a journey faith. He says not a laboratory faith. And you have to think that he has this subtle way of, he doesn't talk about my esteemed predecessor Benedict XVI, whose inaugural speech, the conclave was all about the dangers of relativism and pluralism and doubt and all that kind of stuff. Whereas he's talking about the danger to the church comes from itself, not from the dangers from outside, comes from thinking that it has all the answers, comes from holding Jesus inside and not letting him out and going out to the peripheries, being self-referential. And so he says a journey faith, and he ties that in with the Vatican II idea of the pilgrim people of God, that we're on a journey in which we meet God along the way. And we don't have all the answers in advance. We discover them by making mistakes, by being in dialogue, by encountering other people, by listening to other people. And together through, as Colleen says, discernment, figuring out where God is calling us to go.
I think that's quite right. And I just want to go back to Paul, not because this is an idée fixe and Paul's obsession with fascism should cover the hour and a half, but I think Paul's actually quite right, and certainly fascism is not an uncomfortable bed partner with Catholicism. We have countless examples of alliances between the authoritarian personality, totalitarianism, with the church, seeking accommodation, seeking advantage. But this is not France. This is not Vichy France. It's not L'action française. It's not Austria or Italy or Spain. It's the United States, and the emergence of a quintessentially fascist political culture, which is not the customary or conventional experience of political life in the United States, should really alert our bishops to exercise a prophetic role over against this emerging culture, because they should know from church history that these alliances never work. All the concordance, all the alliances with fascist regimes inevitably fail. So
I suspect your estimate of the historical depth of knowledge of our bishop might be a little overstated. But I also think it come back to Robert's point there. Well, the point, all of you, that fear is the cause of almost all fundamentalism historically, and what's going on in our fascist political surge in this country towards a more authoritarian state, they are afraid. They're afraid of the changing character of our culture. They're afraid of the fact that white guys in nice suits are not going to run the show forever. That's the fear that drives people into this. They're not certain, but this lust for certitude. That's what it is. They're afraid. And I think because they're afraid, in a strange way, I think, one thing we have to do is find a little room for compassion. It's hard to be compassionate to the elite, but understand what's going on at least. It's definitely fear of change. Any
other comment in relation to this? The fear of change seems to be
the elite has a lot of incentive to stir up that kind of fear, and that the rhetoric of political culture is so much. I mean, Fox News, listen, it is all fear. Apparently, there were 1,400 things on Fox News about how the danger that children at trick-or-treating were going to get fentanyl in their candy. Now they'll move on to something else. But we've also gotten to this rhetoric of a kind of Manichaean, polarization of, it's not we just disagree with each other, but the other side are antichrist, the other side are evil, the other side are demonic. They traffic in children, they drink children's blood, and all of that always goes toward generating violence, and it's rooted in fear, as you say. but it moves our culture, and to the extent that the church is infected by that, by very, very dangerous tendencies that make it very difficult to understand how we can find, any kind of common ground.
And of course, again, Francis faces this kind of criticism from within his ranks. Our mutual friend Christopher Lamb has chronicled that in relation to EWTN and the attacks that they make on Francis, his personality, and whether, in fact, in some quarters, not necessarily limited to EWTN, but where he is in fact seen as a fraud or as a fake pope. The Sedis Vacantis make the argument there hasn't been a pope since Pius XII, but not everybody, subscribes to Mel Gibson's historical point of view. But the fact is, a riven church, and we are a riven church, we're a divided church, is nonetheless also provides the seeds for growth and for resurrection. And I think some of the things that have been said by Ish and Colleen, particularly given their perspective as young people on the panel, gives all of us some hope that indeed we can move out of the ruins. But before we do that, and we have to wrap up because it's getting near the end, give us a little spiritual upbeat here, Robert, with Wendy Beckett. How would she view our tortured and turbulent ecclesiopolitics?
Well, not everybody knows who Sister Wendy Beckett is, but she was this famous art nun. She was a contemplative hermit living on the grounds of a Carmelite monastery who became an unlikely celebrity in the 90s with a television program where she'd travel around the world writing about art. When that was all over, she returned to her hermitage. And in the last 3 years of her life, we engaged in a very deep, almost daily correspondence. But she had such, she wore this very medieval-looking habit, looked like something walked out of the Middle Ages. But she had remarkably open views about the church and the world. She adored Pope Francis, was one of the topics we shared in common. And I wrote to her at one point about, how damaged I felt by the church, the sex abuse scandal. And she said, well, you have to look at that as the wounds on the body of Christ, not the body of Christ itself. I found that helpful. Yeah. She also had, very open views about gender, sexuality.
Yes.
Women in the church. Said that, I think that our views about sexuality are so rooted in ancient concepts, and we haven't really caught up with that, but eventually we will. She's felt the same way about the ordination of women and other matters in the church. She said, I think it'll, eventually it'll seem preposterous that we could not imagine women as priests. It does not seem to her to be according to the mind of Jesus. But she just instinctively so identified with Francis's calling the church, to the pattern of Jesus, pattern of mercy and love, rather than judgment and fear. And in that sense, she took a long view of things, but she helped and strengthened my faith a lot.
Yes, it's a great consolation to know you could be in your 80s, liberated, open to all kinds of things, and suffused with hope and a taste for mercy. Well, we've had a good deal of that tonight. I would like to thank the panel, thank all of you for joining us in the conversation, and remind our listeners and our viewers that you can continue this by looking at our weekly blog. We have 18 bloggers from all over, from England and from Ireland, from Rome, from the United States, from Canada, who regularly blog once a week, providing provocative insights in a time of upheaval, reformation, and sometimes visionary thinking. So go to our Go Rebuild blog, and you can access tonight's forum on YouTube. I'd like to make a special thanks to our blog co-editors and coordinators, Callie Tabor and Dan Rober, and who are both from the Department of Catholic Studies at Sacred Heart University, and to thank our logistics team, Lauren and Yuno, who made this very much possible for you this evening in terms of the technology, never an easy thing, and indeed to Vice President Mike Iannazzi for his able guidance and steady direction. Thank you. We look forward to seeing many of you again. We'll have another forum sometime next year when Kaylee and Dan do the planning, and some new panelists. But again, a reminder that you can access what we have already, because we keep a chronicle or archive of many of the different all of the blog entries we've had over the last number of years. Thank you for joining us this evening, and good night.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone. Thank you for this. Great job. Thank you, Dan. Thank